Should Christians listen to rock music? Is something that comes up occasionally. And I'm going to parse this into three ways. The first is, should Christians listen to secular rock music? And then the second will be, should Christians listen to what's called Christian rock music? And then, should Christians listen to or engage with other forms of kind of urban or those kind of musics? Let's say with Christian rap or rap in general. So that's how I'm going to parse this. All right. So beginning with, should Christians listen to secular rock music? Is something that might appear to be kind of a dead debate to some. The reason why is that it kind of hasn't come up in a while. The people that are now leading ministries with worldwide influence are the same people that grew up during the 70s and the 80s, and that they listened to, went to Metallica, Slayer, Pantera concerts when they were younger, and now they kind of just, that's what they listen to now as adults. Like, they don't think it's necessarily a big deal. It's considered classic rock now. It's played on every top 100 radio stations still. Even stuff like Linkin Park, Evanescence, Papa Roach is not really debated anymore. You walk into just about any youth pastor or even children's pastor, even senior pastor's office on a given day, or you come around them when they're working on the yard or whatever, they're probably listening to something like that because it's just kind of been absorbed into the culture now. And so it would seem to be kind of a dead debate, but let's talk about it anyway. Should Christians listen to whatever? And what I would say to that first, before we even get to individual bands, individuals like microgenres or whatever, the first thing I would ask is, why are you making a big deal about music? That's the first question that I would ask. Like, why is this individual challenging my tastes in media consumption? Because that's what it is. It's media. That's the reason that's my first question is that if you aren't challenging me on this out of an individual love for me as an individual, you're just trying to make me jump through hoops to pass your individual kind of Pharisaical legalism test, then you can kick rocks. Simply, that if you're trying to assess my spiritual health so you can judge me, then you can just judge me. I don't care. The second thing is that I would really highlight the fact that Jesus did not come to the earth, live and minister, die one of the most excruciatingly painful, torturous deaths that can be imagined, and then resurrect, and then ascend to heaven at the right hand of God for the purpose of saving music or movies or anything along that line. He came for people. He came for people. So the idea that there's this secular music out there and then there's Christian music is pretentious, to say the least. There is no music that is saved and there is no music that is unsaved. There's just music, and then certain music is worship to God, and then certain music is worship to humans, and then certain music is worship to divine or diabolical deceptive entities. But at the end of the day, it's all worship. So when you are listening to certain music, you have to assess it for its message. And so when you're listening to Five Finger Death Punch or Shine Down or whatever popular music currently, you have to assess it for what is the message that is seeping in? And is that a message that glorifies God? Because if it does not, you should ask some serious questions about it. So the question that comes up with 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s rock music is, what about the ones that talk about sex, the ones that talk about drugs, the ones that talk about violence? And this applies also to urban music as well, whether that's rap, gangster rap, trap music, things of that nature. Like, when it's talking about violence, it's not enough to just say, well, it mentions gun violence in urban areas, or it mentions military actions that are politically motivated elsewhere in the world. It's not enough that it talks about drugs. What is it saying specifically about those things? For instance, Master of Puppets is talking about being under the control of, at first it was cocaine, and then later James Hetfield was talking about how that it really made him challenge his passionate, it helped him, I guess you could say, fuel his rehabilitation from alcoholism later as well. That he refers to it as that it's an exposition, that he's exposing the nature of these things, that it's a master and that I'm its puppet. That's not necessarily a bad message for people to hear, that drugs are not your friend, they're a master, and they will make you a slave or a puppet. So that, of course, is kind of subjective, and it's giving it a lot more benefit of the doubt than some people would. But there's other things, like the ones that are talking about sex. Is it glorifying sex? Is it glorifying ungodly forms of sex? And that is it, or is it confining it in a biblical way, like confining it in a manner that is consistent with one man, one woman forever? So, things of that nature. Like, there's a lot of stuff that I hear people listening to from like the 20s, 30s, jazz music, big band music, that when you listen to what they're saying, it sounds horrendous. That it objectifies women and that it glorifies ungodly sex and things. But because it's almost 100 years old now or more, people are like, well, no big deal, it's just a classic. And that appears to be the transition that is occurring with this classic rock as well, which is why I said, like, it's kind of a dead debate. People don't even bother with it because they're like, well, it's just a classic, let it go. But we do still need to assess these things. We need to consider, is that seeping into my heart? Because I would actually say that it is possible as an adult. It is possible for me to listen to something, see the message, and disregard it. It is possible. In the same way that you can be eating something on your plate, realize that there's something on that plate that you don't want to consume, and then just move it to the side. Like, children master this rather quickly, right? Moving their vegetables around. That you can just move that to the side, eat the thing that I want, and then leave the rest. It is possible to do that, but you have to make conscious decisions about doing that very thing. And I think a lot of people, when they're in music, they're usually focused on something else. They're doing yard work, or they're in an emotional state where they're trying to grieve, or they're trying to whatever, and they're not engaging those intellectual muscles of their brain. And that is when these kind of subliminal, you might call them, or just lyrical messages will seep in unknowingly, because they're using music as a means of retreat from, escapism from the things that they're going through. And when you are doing that, of course, you are going to struggle more with filtering those things out. So that's the next thing. And then, honestly, the next thing to really consider about all of this is that what's the best thing that I could spend my time on listening to? It's a hard subject to really parse, but what is the best thing I can listen to? And I would not say that the best thing that you can be listening to is Chris Tomlin, Stephen Curtis Chapman, whatever popular CCM or Christian contemporary music happens to be, because a lot of that stuff is just as shallow and superficial as what we would call secular music over there. But because the word Jesus is slapped in there in a ramshackle way once or a few times, we give it the stamp of approval. But it's just as weak and whatever. And there's plenty of Christian music as well that talks about sex, that talks about marital relationships and boyfriend-girlfriend relationships or whatever, like in a similar vein to what we call secular music, but because it's played on K-Love or Air One instead, we just give it a pass, and we shouldn't be doing that. You need to be just as discernful when you're listening to that stuff as you are, because there's a lot of liberalistic and progressivistic theological kind of messaging that comes through that stuff as through, I don't know, fill in the blank secular band. And that it's very easy to do the same thing that I was just describing, where you just kind of turn your brain off and I'm just listening to this on the radio while I'm driving around town, and that you're not thinking through it critically. And not thinking through it critically can result in you being shipwrecked theologically because you thought this was safe when it's actually maybe even more dangerous. So that's something to consider. But what is the best thing for you to listen to? I personally, where I'm at currently, I really don't listen to very much music at all. I listen to a lot of audiobooks, I listen to a lot of podcasts, a lot of sermons, a lot of preaching and things, because those things are really engaging for me. Maybe you're not the way that I am, that's fine. I'm not saying that you need to be exactly like I am. But when you have an extended amount of time available to you, listening through, I don't know, something by C.S. Lewis or something by William Lane Craig can be really spiritually edifying. And so I find that to be just as, if not more so, even worshipful as I'm listening to it than whatever music. So that is something I would suggest, is that maybe you need something that does intentionally edify, strengthen, encourage, empower your intellectual faculties, refining those things so that when later you are listening to fill-in-the-blank music, you can utilize those strengthened intellects towards those things. It'll literally reinforce your spiritual filters. So that's one thing that I would encourage, is like, what is the best? Because we often make, in actually Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis, he makes the point that the evil one, the enemy, loves to send temptations in pairs. And that as those temptations are coming to you, that you'll push one away and cleave to the other one unintentionally or even intentionally, thinking that that basically I have to choose one or the other to align with, and you don't. And that you end up cleaving onto an evil thing on behalf of a desire to avoid some other evil thing. And you end up choosing a bad thing and thinking that it was good or bad, lose-lose, or win-lose, when in fact you could have instead gone for what is best. And that is kind of what I try to with high school, junior high, college people that I'm surrounded by influentially. I try to influence of that, not just what sounds good, but what is best. You can like whatever you like as far as instrumentation, beats, artists, like whatever. Like, you can like whatever you like, but the question needs to not be what is good or bad, but what is best in a situation, because we often try to settle for what seems good rather than pursuing what is God's best for us. We see this in relationships where, well, she's not a believer per se, but she's kind of hot though. Like, we do this kind of thing of that it seems good, but it is not what God's best is for us, and it always ends up being destructive for us in the long run. So that is what I would encourage you with. Pursuing God's best. Sometimes that does mean, as many people have done, I'm going to have to forsake certain music genres, styles for a long period of time so that I can kind of purify my mind and heart, and that later maybe you can reintroduce yourself to those things. I went through that process. There was a long period where I could only really listen to Christian rock, because if I strayed over onto the other side of listening to what's called secular rock, it would take me down paths that I didn't want to go. And I knew that that's kind of the gate for me that I can manage in a reasonable way. So I'll draw the line there, and then later, as you can see, I began to reintroduce myself to it later, where I was spiritually strong enough, healthy enough to move the gate forwards, not backwards. So the second thing that I did want to talk about is the subject of what about Christian rock, because there's a lot of people that would suggest or try to insinuate that it's the same thing. Even Skillet is one of the bands that has received a lot of criticism for touring with secular bands, Godsmack and Korn, and some of these other like really aggressive, like hard partying ones, Breaking Benjamin or whatever, that now they've sold out. And so, is it safe? And for what I would say is this: John Cooper might be the most important Christian intellectual thinker of our current age. And that's a weird thing for a lot of people to say, due to the fact that, maybe for me to say, because there's a lot of really important Christian and intellectuals out there. But the thing about this is that he's engaging against the progressivist movement in a way that a lot of people have been avoiding. They've been afraid to touch it because they were afraid of losing their constituency, or they've been afraid of kind of losing they've been afraid of being painted in a specific way, politically or sociologically, and he's been engaging in that fearlessly, in a way that a lot of have been honestly too cowardly to do so. And so he's in a fight that a lot of people that are not, and it's cost him some stuff, specifically, like, because of this, that the band Skillet that he is the frontman of has lost fans over this, like all this, like, so that's one thing. Like, he's paid some prices, but also like I said, I listen to podcasts. His podcast, Cooper Stuff, is amazing and is highly recommended from me. I would highly recommend it. Even if you think you disagree with him, you should go there and you should follow it and you should listen and hear him out and see if by the end you don't actually begin to agree with him. That's what I'm saying. So that's what I would suggest. And then I am fully under the impression of that if you like the sound of secular rock, maybe the best thing that you can actually do is to engage with Christian rock, because of the fact that it has a lot of the same instrumentation and creativity, but it doesn't have the, let's say, the worldliness to it that is kind of the main subject that people like to criticize. And that it'll actually, as people are engaging with it, it's actually, what you might say is, cause people to lose their appetite for secular music, because they're like, this is just as good and I don't have to corrupt myself with those things that I've been trying to avoid. So I would highly recommend Skillet, Red, Demon Hunter, Decipher Down, some of these bands, um, and many of which I've actually met personally. Uh, Nothing but respect for them, and as artists, respect for them as, in a lot of ways, theologians even. Um, that they are really dense, especially the guys from like Red. Until We All Have Faces is actually named after a C.S. Lewis book, and that Demon Hunter, um, they're artists. Like from they approach their music from a very artistic way, creatively, but they appear to have a lot more of kind of a dense theological um, footing underneath their music that is highly respectable. And of course, Skillet, every single album of theirs is just straight fire. So that's what I would say, is that you definitely should be, and that you should be following these people externally from just their music, because them as individuals are incredible Christian leaders. And then what about other forms of more, what you might say, urban music that's become the subject of controversy now, whether it's Lecrae, KB, Tripoli, NF, these like we call Christian rappers, or rappers that are Christian, the 116 clique. Is this safe? Because the fact that it's the same exact debate, we're just talking about a different genre. And I would say that the first thing for people to be conscious of is your criticism of this really over the subject of spiritual value in the music, or is it actually something more of a racial or a social bigotry against something that sounds like a social group that you are suspicious of politically, suspicious of ideologically, or suspicious of on the basis of like baser things like skin color? Like you should ask yourself that question. Now, I'm not the one to say, oh, because you're a racist. I would distance myself from that form of criticism as far as I can get, because I feel like in a lot of ways it's overused. And then also, I don't know you personally. I don't have that kind of access to use those sort of criticisms. I would say, though, that you should do an internal inventory and see if the seeds of those things are not underneath it, that you personally are prone to a form of prejudice that maybe you're blind to, that you should repent of. And I'm not saying that you need to join some sort of thing or you need to do some sort of penance. I'm not saying any of those things. It's just do an assessment, and if you find that there's nothing, then you found nothing. That's good. If you do that assessment, you do find something, that also is good, because now you're aware of it. That's the thing. Do the assessment. The next thing is that you need to strongly consider is, just because it sounds similar, same thing that we were talking about with Christian rock, just because it sounds similar does not mean it's the same. And so if this stuff ends up being something of a gateway for you to start finding out about things like NWA or whatever, like, maybe it's not that good for you. Like, know where, like, find out where your limitations are, and then respect your own boundaries. And then the next thing is that you need to find out about the people behind the music, not just the critics of the music. You need to, so if you hear about, like, let's say KB, let's say Lecrae, let's say Andy Mineo, whoever, if you come across a blog that's criticizing them, don't just click the blog, go past that and actually do some personal research into the people themselves. What do they believe? What do they espouse? Who are they associated with? And then go from there. Actually do some like next level research before you just accept someone's opinion about them uncritically. That's what I'd say of it. And the same thing applies to the Christian rock of like, go deeper on this. Don't just accept someone else's insight. Because, quite frankly, as we all know, just the same as that some of these artists and musicians and whatever have agendas, the publishers of these their music and content have agendas, so do the people that are the discernment ministries that are attempting to criticize these artists, whether that's Andy Mineo, or if that's Trip Lee, or if that's John Cooper, or if that's whoever. Those people have just as much agendas, and that those agendas are prone to changing, and that honestly, those agendas are not always as well intended as it may seem. So recognize that nobody is without a bias. Everyone that is publishing content, they're trying to make money from it. They're trying to get clicks from it and so forth. All of that fuels the desire to be more hyperbolic, to be less gracious and generous towards others, and so forth. So consider those things as reality too. And then last thing is that don't criticize things that you don't know anything about. Do not subscribe to criticisms about things necessarily that you don't know anything about. So if, in fact, let's say Harry Potter was the thing for a little while during the early thousands, or there's so many of them that it's almost impossible to seemingly keep up. But if people that are in your church or in your Bible study or whatever it is are criticizing an artist or a genre of music, do some personal investigation and see what's in it before, like in the same way of like, if people are pointing at a bush and saying there's a monster behind there, don't just open fire blindly. Take a look, right? You're not sure if there's a person there or an animal. Don't shoot, right? Make sure. Check your lines. The same thing is true here, that don't just blindly trust the insight of someone else, because they might not be as well-meaning as you think they are. Don't be naive. That's what Jesus actually taught, right? You must be innocent as doves according to evil, but you must be cunning as serpents according to, like, it's very important that, especially in our day where everyone has the license and ability to speak, not everyone's voices are worth listening to, and that there's so much noise out there that it becomes difficult